The doorbell rang at 7:40 on a Tuesday evening, and when I opened it, the woman standing on my porch was someone I hadn't seen in 15 years. My name is Jason. I'm 52 years old. I run a small contracting company here in Savannah, and the woman on my porch that night, grayer at the temples than I remembered, a coat too heavy for the mild October evening, hands folded in front of her like she was bracing for something, was my ex-wife, Renata. Jason, she said. Just my name. Like she'd been rehearsing it the whole drive over, and that was as far as the rehearsal got. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, one hand still on the frame, my dinner going cold on the counter behind me. 15 years is a long time. Long enough that I'd built an entire second life in the space where our marriage used to be. A quiet house, a business I was proud of, a daughter, Mia, who was 23 now and had her mother's eyes and, as far as I knew, hadn't spoken to her mother in almost a decade. Long enough that I genuinely believed I'd stopped being the kind of man this doorbell ring could rattle. I was wrong about that. I want to be honest about that from the start. Can I come in? She asked. Just for a few minutes. I wouldn't have come if it wasn't. She stopped herself, the way she used to stop herself mid-sentence back when we were married, right before saying something she decided wasn't safe to finish. I didn't answer right away. Instead, standing there in my own doorway with the porch light throwing long shadows across her face, I found myself pulled backward, 15 years, to a version of my life I'd spent a long time trying to stop revisiting. I need to take you back, because you won't understand what it cost me to leave that door open a crack that night unless you understand what happened the last time she stood in front of me like that. Back then, I was 37. Renata was 34. We'd been married 12 years, had a daughter, Mia, who was 8 and obsessed with horses, and had just lost her first tooth that spring. We had a house on a quiet street near Forsyth Park, the kind of house you buy when you think you've figured out how the rest of your life is going to go. I ran a smaller version of the company I run now, mostly residential renovations, and Renata worked part-time at a design firm downtown while raising Mia and, in ways I didn't fully appreciate at the time, quietly raising the rest of our household too. I thought we were fine. That's the part that still sits strangely in my chest. Even now, 15 years later, standing in a different doorway with a different version of both of us. I thought fine was the same thing as good. I didn't understand yet that a marriage can be running perfectly on the surface, bills paid, dinners cooked, a daughter thriving, while something underneath it has already started to come apart. The man's name was Victor. He was a client of mine. Actually, I was doing a kitchen renovation for him and his wife on Whitaker Street, and Renata met him twice, maybe 3 times, at get-togethers connected to the job. I remember him as unremarkable. Tall, easy laugh, the kind of guy who remembered everyone's name at a party. I had no reason to think about him twice. I didn't know it yet, standing in my own kitchen back then, half listening to Renata tell me about her day while I went through invoices at the table, that the quiet space growing between us had already found somewhere else to be filled. That night, 15 years later, standing in my doorway with my ex-wife asking to come in, I made a decision I hadn't planned to make. 5 minutes, I said. She nodded, quick, grateful, and stepped past me into a house she'd never once set foot in, because I'd bought it, built it, filled it, entirely in the 15 years since the day she walked out of the one we used to share. She stood in my living room looking around like she was trying to find some piece of the man she used to know somewhere in the furniture, and I stood a few feet away, arms crossed, waiting to hear whatever she'd driven 3 hours to say. I heard about your mother, she said instead, which wasn't at all what I expected. I'm sorry, Jason. I know how close you two were. Is that why you're here? To offer condolences 15 years late? No. She looked down at her hands. No, that's not. I heard about it from a mutual friend, and it made me realize how much time has actually passed, and she stopped again. That same old habit, a sentence abandoned halfway through. I waited. I'd gotten good at waiting. Over the years, patient with clients, patient with subcontractors who ran behind schedule, patient in a way that used to be one of my better qualities and had slowly, somewhere along the way, become something closer to a wall. I want to talk to Mia, she finally said. I know I don't have the right to ask that. I know that. But I don't have much time left to ask it, Jason, and I needed to see you first before I tried. Something in the way she said, I don't have much time left made the room go very quiet around me. In a way I wasn't prepared for on a Tuesday evening that had started out entirely ordinary. I didn't know it yet, standing in my own living room with the woman who'd once broken something in me that took years to fully understand the shape of. But whatever she'd come to tell me that night wasn't going to be the only thing this visit reopened, and it wasn't going to be nearly the hardest part of what I'd have to face before the year was over. I told Renata to sit down, and she did, perched on the edge of my couch like a guest who wasn't sure she'd been fully welcomed, which she hadn't. I stayed standing by the window, needing the distance, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "Before I tell you anything about Mia," I said, "I need you to understand something. I've spent 15 years building a life that doesn't need you in it. I'm not interested in reopening old wounds just because you're scared of whatever's happening to you." "I know," she said quietly. "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight." "Good. Because I won't." She flinched, just slightly, and something about that flinch pulled me backward again, 15 years, to a version of this same woman sitting across a different table, a different house, a different version of both of us who hadn't yet learned what we were about to learn about each other. Back then, in the year before everything fell apart, our life had a rhythm that looked, from the outside, like it was working. I left early most mornings for job sites, a kitchen gut on Whitaker Street, a bathroom addition out past the historic district, and Renata got Mia ready for second grade, dropped her off, then went into the design firm 3 days a week. Evenings were dinner together, homework at the kitchen table, Mia narrating some elaborate story about her stuffed horses while Renata and I traded the kind of small talk that fills a house, without actually saying much. I didn't notice, at the time, that Renata had started staying later at the design firm on the days she worked. I didn't notice that when I asked about her day, her answers had gotten shorter. Fine, busy, same as usual, where they used to run longer, more detailed, full of stories about difficult clients or funny things a coworker had said. I filed the change away, if I filed it at all, as a natural part of married life. People get tired. People get quieter. I told myself that was all it was. My business partner at the time, Carl, mentioned once, almost in passing, that he'd seen Renata having coffee downtown with a man he didn't recognize, some guy. Tall. Looked like he was in construction himself, Carl said, shrugging it off, not thinking twice about it. I didn't think twice about it either. Renata knew plenty of people connected to my work. It didn't strike me as strange. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever looked back at a small, forgettable comment someone made in passing and realized, years later, that it was actually the first thread of something much larger, you already know the particular kind of dread that comes with that realization. The Whitaker Street job kept me busy that spring. Victor and his wife, Denise, were easy clients, the kind who trusted your judgment and didn't hover over every decision. And I remember thinking, at the time, how nice it was to work with people who seemed genuinely happy together. Denise would bring iced tea out to the crew on hot afternoons. Victor talked about wanting the new kitchen to be a place where they'd actually cook together more, now that their own kids were mostly grown and gone. I had no reason, back then, to connect any of that to my own kitchen table, where Renata had started keeping her phone face down more often than not. She told me, much later, what those weeks had actually felt like on her end. I didn't know any of it at the time. I told myself it started as nothing. He asked me to grab coffee after I dropped off some fabric samples for Denise, and it was just easy, is the word I keep coming back to. Easy in a way things at home hadn't felt easy in a long time. Not because you'd done anything wrong, Jason, but because somewhere in those 12 years I'd stopped being someone you actually looked at, and I'd stopped noticing that I'd stopped noticing it too, if that makes sense. Victor asked me questions nobody had asked me in years. Not about Mia, not about the house, about me, what I actually wanted, and I didn't even have a good answer, and that scared me more than anything he said after it. That's what she told me. At the time, all I had was a phone kept face down and a business partner's offhand comment I'd already half forgotten. Mia's 8th birthday fell that April, and I remember it now with a clarity that surprises me. A backyard full of kids, a rented pony because Mia had begged for one for months, Renata laughing at something with a group of other mothers by the drink table, looking, from where I stood flipping burgers, entirely like the woman I'd married. I didn't see anything wrong that day. I've gone back over that memory more times than I'd like to admit, searching for a crack I must have missed, and I still can't find one. That's the part that unsettled me most. once I finally understood everything, that the surface had held so completely, for so long, that I never once thought to look underneath it. Renata's sister, Paulette, called me not long after that birthday party, which was unusual. Paulette and I got along fine, but we didn't typically talk one-on-one. "Everything good with you too?" she asked, in a tone I didn't think much of at the time. "Why wouldn't it be?" "No reason," Paulette said, a little too quickly. "Just checking in." I let it go. 15 years later, sitting across from Renata in my living room, I finally understood what Paulette had actually been asking me that day, and how close she'd come to telling me the truth herself, months before I ever found it out on my own. "Jason," Renata said now, pulling me back into the present, into the room, into the fact of her sitting on my couch after 15 years of silence. "I know you don't owe me anything, but I need you to hear the rest of it before I ask you about Mia. I need you to understand what actually happened that year. Not the version you've probably told yourself for 15 years, the real one." I sat down, finally, across from her, my arms still crossed, unwilling to give her more than the chair itself. "You have 5 more minutes," I said. "Make them count." "It didn't start the way you probably think it did," she said. "I know what version you've carried around for 15 years, and I understand why. But I need to walk you through it in order, because the order matters, Jason. It matters more than you know." I didn't answer. I just watched her, waiting, the same way I'd learned to wait 15 years ago without realizing that waiting itself had already become a kind of surrender. "That summer," she said, "I started noticing something in myself I didn't like. I'd catch myself checking my phone before I even knew what I was checking it for. I'd catch myself picking out what I wore on the days I knew I might run into him somewhere, telling myself it was just coincidence I might see him at all. I want to take you back to that same summer, because I remember it differently than she's telling it. I remember it from the outside, the version available to a husband who wasn't looking closely enough to see what was actually happening underneath. I remember Renata starting to go to a Wednesday evening yoga class that spring, something new, something she said she needed for herself. I thought that was healthy. I encouraged it, even told her she deserved time that was just hers. I had no idea the class ran until 8 and she often didn't get home until 9:30, and even less idea that I never once asked her why. I remember a receipt I found in her jacket pocket doing laundry, a coffee shop downtown, 2 drinks, a Tuesday afternoon when she told me she was running errands. I remember looking at it for a moment longer than I needed to, and then folding it back into the pocket exactly where I'd found it, telling myself it was nothing, telling myself I trusted her, telling myself that a man who went looking for reasons to doubt his wife was a man who didn't deserve the marriage he had. Looking back now, I understand that receipt was the first real signal I chose not to see. I called it nothing at the time. I wouldn't call it that anymore. I remember Carl mentioning Victor's name again, this time not in passing but with a little more weight behind it. "Your guy on Whitaker Street. I keep seeing his truck parked outside that coffee place downtown on my lunch break. Must be a popular spot." And I remember laughing it off, telling Carl that plenty of contractors probably liked that particular coffee shop, that it didn't mean anything. I want to stop here for a second. There's a specific kind of denial that doesn't feel like denial while you're inside it. It feels like trust, like faith, like being the kind of steady, reasonable man who doesn't jump to conclusions. I didn't understand, yet that denial isn't weakness. It's a decision. You choose it because the alternative costs more than you're ready to pay. Renata, sitting across from me 15 years later, kept talking, her voice quieter now, more careful. "I tried to stop it once, that summer," she said. "I told him I couldn't keep doing it, that it wasn't fair to you or to Mia. I meant it, Jason. I really did, in the moment." "How long did that last?" She looked down at her hands. 11 days. 11 days. I sat with that number for a moment, the specific precision of it landing harder than a vaguer answer would have. 15 years of imagining a version of that summer, and somehow the exact number still managed to surprise me. "I don't have a good excuse for going back," she said. "I've had 15 years to come up with one, and I still don't have one that actually holds up. That summer, back then, Denise, Victor's wife, invited us both to a small dinner party at their house on Whitaker Street, once the kitchen renovation was finally finished. I remember standing in that kitchen I'd built with my own crew, admiring the cabinetry, while Renata and Victor stood near the new island, laughing at something I hadn't heard the beginning of. I remember thinking, at the time, how good it felt to see two of my clients happy in a space I'd helped create for them. I had no idea I was standing inside the exact place where my own marriage had already started quietly falling apart. She told me, later, what that dinner party had actually felt like from her side of it, a moment that mattered more than I understood at the time. I remember standing in that kitchen watching you talk to Denise about grout color, completely unaware, completely trusting, and something in me wanted to walk over and tell you everything right there, in front of everyone, just to make it stop. I opened my mouth once. Victor caught my eye from across the room, just for a second, and something in his expression, panic, maybe, or just plain fear of being caught, made me close my mouth again and go back to laughing at whatever he'd just said. I told myself there'd be a better time to end it. There's always a better time, Jason, until suddenly there isn't one left at all. That's what she told me, 15 years after the fact. At the time, I drove us home from that dinner party thinking it had been a genuinely nice evening. Mia had a dance recital that August, her first one, tap shoes and a sequin costume she was inordinately proud of, and I remember Renata crying in the audience, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, and I remember putting my arm around her, assuming it was ordinary parental sentimentality. I understand now, sitting across from her 15 years later, that those weren't entirely happy tears. Some of them were guilt, sitting right there in a school auditorium, disguised as pride. I want you to know, Renata said now, that I never stopped loving Mia. Whatever else I got wrong that year, and I got almost everything wrong, I never once stopped loving our daughter. I need you to believe that, even if you don't believe anything else I tell you tonight. I didn't answer right away. 15 years ago, I'd have needed to hear that. That night, sitting in my own living room, I found I didn't need anything from her anymore. I just needed to hear the rest of what she'd come to say. Keep going, I said. You still haven't told me why you're actually here. She took a breath, the kind of breath someone takes right before they say the thing they've been avoiding the longest, and I didn't know it yet. But whatever came next was going to reshape everything I thought I understood about the year my marriage ended. I found out in October, I said, before she could go any further. You should know that. I need you to know I'm not hearing any of this for the first time. Renata went still. You found out that October? I thought. She stopped herself. I thought it was later. I thought it was after. No, it was before you told me anything. I already knew. I want to take you back to that October, 15 years ago, because that's the part of the story I've never told anyone in full. Not Carl, not my mother before she passed, not even, until that night, Renata herself. It started with a phone bill. Small thing, forgettable, the kind of detail you'd miss if you weren't already looking for something. I handled our finances back then, still do out of habit, and I noticed a number that showed up too many times in a single month. Not hidden exactly, just unfamiliar, appearing at hours that didn't line up with any explanation Renata had given me. 9:40 at night, 6 in the morning, once, while I was already up making coffee and she was supposedly still asleep upstairs. I didn't confront her. I told myself I needed more before I said anything. The same story careful men tell themselves right up until the moment they finally can't tell it anymore. I called the number once, from a payphone outside a hardware store, because some part of me understood that calling from my own cell would leave a trace I wasn't ready to explain. A man answered. I recognized the voice before he even said his name. I hung up without saying anything. That was the moment. Looking back now, I understand that everything before it, the receipt, Carl's comment about the coffee shop, the dinner party at Whitaker Street, had already told me everything I needed to know. I just hadn't let myself add it up yet. The phone call didn't break something new in me. It confirmed what I'd already quietly buried for months. I followed her twice after that. Once to the same downtown coffee shop, where I sat in my truck across the street and watched her sit across from Victor for 40 minutes, their hands close together on the table without quite touching, the particular kind of closeness that doesn't need touching to be obvious to anyone actually looking. Once to a motel off Ogeechee Road, where I parked 3 spaces down and watched her car sit in the lot for 2 hours before she came back out, checking her reflection in the side mirror before she drove home to me and Mia like nothing had happened. I didn't say anything that night either. I remember sitting across from her at dinner, Mia telling us some long story about a classroom hamster, and I remember thinking, genuinely, clearly thinking, that I could simply keep not saying anything indefinitely, that silence might actually be a sustainable way to live inside a marriage that had already ended in every way that mattered except the official one. I want to stop here for a second. There's a specific kind of quiet a man carries when he already knows the truth and hasn't decided yet what to do with it. It doesn't feel like anger, not at first. It feels almost like grief that hasn't been given permission to start. I knew for 3 weeks before I said anything. I told Renata, 15 years later, in my own living room. 3 weeks of watching you lie to my face at that same dinner table, telling me about your day like nothing had changed. I didn't know that, she said quietly. I never knew you'd found out before I told you. You didn't tell me anything, Renata. I told you what I already knew. There's a difference. She nodded slowly, absorbing that. Something in her expression shifting. Not surprise exactly. More like a fact settling into a place it had never quite occupied before. I understood something that October I hadn't let myself understand before. Silence isn't the absence of a decision. It's a decision itself. Every day, I didn't say anything. I was choosing to keep living inside a version of my marriage I already knew wasn't real anymore. Paulette called me again that same week. The second time in months she'd reached out to me directly instead of through Renata, and this time there was no pretense of a casual check-in. Jason, she said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not ask me how long I've known. I already know, Paulette. A long pause on the line. Oh, she said finally, quieter. Oh, Jason, I'm so sorry. I should have told you months ago. I've hated myself for not saying something. You should have, I said. But I understand why you didn't. I didn't tell Renata that night, back then, that I'd already spoken to her sister. I didn't tell her about the phone call, the coffee shop, the motel off Ogeechee Road. I gathered it all instead. The way you gather evidence for a case you already know the verdict of, not because I needed more proof for myself, but because some part of me understood that whenever I finally said something out loud, I needed to be certain enough that there'd be no room left for her to talk her way around it. Sitting in my living room 15 years later, I watched Renata absorb all of this. The timeline she hadn't known, the sister who'd carried the secret longer than either of us realized, the 3 weeks of silence I'd kept from her while she thought she was still successfully hiding something. So when you finally said something, she said slowly, you'd already decided. I'd already decided, I said. I just hadn't figured out yet how I wanted to say it. She was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her hands again, and I understood, watching her, that whatever she'd actually come to my door to ask me that night was still sitting unspoken between us, waiting for both of us to finish walking through the last of what had happened 15 years before either of us would be ready to talk about it. I told you on a Sunday, I said. Do you remember that part? I remember, she said. You'd made pancakes. Mia's favorite kind, with the chocolate chips. I made pancakes because I needed something to do with my hands before I said it. I want to take you back to that Sunday morning, 15 years ago, because it's the one memory from that whole year I've never had to work to keep sharp. Mia was at a friend's house for a sleepover. Renata came downstairs in her robe, hair still damp from the shower, and sat down across from me at the kitchen table like it was any other morning. I know about Victor, I said. No preamble. I decided, somewhere in those 3 weeks of silence, that I wasn't going to give her the chance to shape how this moment started. She went white. I remember that clearly, the color actually leaving her face, her hand freezing halfway to her coffee cup. Jason, don't. I set the spatula down. I know about the coffee shop. I know about the motel on Ogeechee Road. I called the number on our phone bill myself, back in September. I've known for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Her voice cracked. You've known for 3 weeks, and you didn't say anything? I was deciding what I wanted to say. She started crying then, not composed, not the tears of someone managing a difficult conversation, but the full, undignified kind, and she came around the table and dropped to her knees beside my chair, grabbing my hands before I could pull them away. Please, she said. Please, Jason, I'll end it today, right now. I'll never see him again, I swear to you. Get up, Renata. I don't know what happened to me. I don't. Please don't do this. Think about Mia. Think about everything we built. I laughed. It came out of me before I could stop it. Not cruel, not mockery, just shock finding the only exit left available to it. A sound I didn't recognize as my own. She flinched back like I'd struck her. 12 years, I said, once I could talk again. 12 years, Renata. And you're on the kitchen floor asking me to forget it happened. Like this is a dish you broke. That's not what I'm. You gave away something I spent 12 years trying to build with you. My voice stayed level, quieter than I expected of myself, which I think frightened her more than shouting would have. The trust. The version of you I actually believed I knew. I watched you sit across from me at this exact table for 3 weeks, lying to my face, telling me about your day like nothing had changed. I don't think you even understand what that did to me. Tell me what to do, she said, still on the floor, still holding my hands even as I tried, gently, to pull them free. I'll do anything. Counseling, whatever you need, I'll never. I already know what I need to do, I said. I decided that 3 weeks ago too. 15 years later, in my living room, Renata was quiet for a long moment after I finished telling her all of this. The parts she hadn't lived through the same way I had. The 3 weeks she never knew about. The pancakes I made because I needed something to occupy my hands before I said the thing that ended our marriage. I never really understood what those 3 weeks cost you, she said finally. I understood what the affair cost you. I don't think I ever let myself think about what came after, you knowing and saying nothing every single day. No, I said. I don't think you did. She wiped her eyes, composing herself the way she used to when Mia was small and crying about something and needed a parent to be steady. Can I finish telling you? The rest of it? I need you to understand the rest before I ask you about Mia. I nodded, once, and she took a breath. It started that spring, at a dinner where I felt completely invisible, she said. You were talking to Denise about grout samples, and I was standing there thinking, nobody in this room actually sees me. Not you, not anyone. And then Victor asked me something nobody had asked me in years. He asked what I actually wanted, not what the house needed, not what Mia needed. What I wanted. I didn't even have an answer, and that terrified me more than anything. I told myself it was nothing. One conversation. I told myself the same thing the first time he kissed me, that it didn't count if I never let it happen again. I actually believed that, Jason. I think I needed to. But then there was another time. And another. Every time I told myself the same lie, this is the last one, and every time it got a little easier to believe it a little less. I started rearranging things without admitting to myself that's what I was doing. The yoga class that ran too long. The errands that took an extra hour. I became someone who was genuinely good at lying to you. That should have terrified me more than it did. I couldn't look at Mia's drawings on the fridge some mornings. There's one she made that spring, all 3 of us at the beach, and I'd stand there with my coffee and not be able to look at it directly, because I knew what I'd done the night before, and she didn't know, and you didn't know, and I was the only one carrying it. I tried to stop it once that summer. Lasted 11 days. I don't have a good excuse for going back. I just did. I loved you the whole time, Jason. I need you to know that was never not true. I just stopped feeling like myself somewhere inside loving you. And I went looking for her in exactly the wrong place, with exactly the wrong man, and I dragged our daughter into the wreckage of it without ever really letting myself think about what I was doing until it was already done. The room was quiet after that. Somewhere outside, a car passed, headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling. Thank you for telling me, I said finally. 15 years late. But thank you. I didn't know it yet. Sitting there with the full weight of her confession finally spoken out loud after a decade and a half of silence. But the reason she'd actually come to my door that night was about to change everything I thought I understood about how this conversation was supposed to end. Now tell me why you're really here, I said. The pancakes, the divorce, all of it. I've carried that for 15 years. I don't need you to explain it to me anymore. So tell me what you actually came to ask. Renata straightened on the couch, wiping her face one more time, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed, steadier, but with something underneath it that sounded like fear she'd been holding back the whole visit. I have stage 4 ovarian cancer, she said. I found out 4 months ago. I didn't say anything right away. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the way rooms do when something lands before your mind has caught up to it. The doctors are giving me somewhere between 6 months and a year, she continued, depending on how I respond to treatment, which so far hasn't been well. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I need to see Mia before I run out of time, and I know I don't have the right to ask you to help make that happen. But I'm asking anyway, because you're the only person left who might actually say yes. I sat back in my chair, absorbing it. Not the affair anymore, not the 15 years of silence, but this new, blunter fact sitting in the middle of my living room. Does Paulette know? She's known since the diagnosis. She's the one who convinced me to come see you first, instead of just showing up at Mia's door and terrifying her. Mia doesn't talk about you, I said. I want you to understand that before you get your hopes up. She was 8 when you left. She spent 15 years building a life where you're mostly just an absence. I don't know if she'll want to see you at all. I know, Renata said. I know that's the most likely outcome. I just needed to try before I couldn't anymore. I thought about Mia, 23 now, working as a nurse 2 towns over, a young woman who'd grown up asking fewer and fewer questions about her mother as the years went on, until eventually she stopped asking at all. I thought about the version of fatherhood I'd built in the wake of Renata leaving. Steady, present, maybe too controlled, too careful, a man who'd gotten so good at not needing anyone that he sometimes forgot to let his own daughter need him back. I'll ask her, I said finally. That's all I can promise you. I'll tell her you're here. I'll tell her what you told me tonight. And whatever she decides, I'm not going to push her either way. That's all I'm asking, Renata said, and something in her face, relief, maybe, or just the exhaustion of having finally said the hardest part out loud, made her look, for a moment, like the woman I'd married 27 years earlier, before any of this had happened to either of us. She stood to leave a few minutes later, gathering her coat, and paused at the door. For what it's worth, she said, leaving that morning was the loneliest thing I've ever done. I want you to know it wasn't easy, walking away from you and Mia, even knowing I'd earned every bit of the leaving. I believe you, I said. It doesn't change anything, but I believe you. She left. I stood in my doorway watching her taillights disappear down the street, the same street I'd built an entire second life on, and I felt something in my chest that I hadn't expected to feel. Not forgiveness exactly, and not the old anger either, but something quieter than both, something closer to the specific relief of finally setting down a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd stopped noticing its shape. I called Mia the next morning. She was quiet for a long time after I told her everything, the diagnosis, the visit, her mother's request, and when she finally spoke, her voice was careful in a way that reminded me, painfully, of her mother 15 years earlier. I don't know if I want to see her, Mia said, but I think I need to decide that for myself. Not because you're asking me to, because I get to choose, finally, instead of just having it decided for me the way it was when I was 8. That's fair, I said. That's more than fair. She called Renata 3 weeks later. I don't know everything that was said between them. Some of it belongs to the two of them now, not to me. But I know they met once, at a coffee shop not far from where I live. And I know Mia came to my house afterward and sat at my kitchen table and cried for the first time in years about a mother she'd spent a decade and a half refusing to think about. Renata passed the following spring. I didn't go to the funeral. Mia did, and came back afterward and told me, quietly, that she was glad she'd had the chance to say goodbye, even if goodbye had come 15 years later than it should have. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't have understood at 37, standing over a stack of pancakes I didn't know how to stop making. Leaving cleanly wasn't the same thing as healing. I'd told myself, for 15 years, that I'd handled the divorce well. No bitterness, no drama. Just a clean, steady exit into a new life. I understand now that steadiness and healing aren't the same thing. I'd just gotten very good at not feeling what I hadn't finished feeling. I started sleeping better after that spring, oddly enough. Not because the grief was gone, but because I'd finally let myself feel the whole of it, instead of the carefully managed version I'd been carrying for 15 years. Mia asked me once, a few months after the funeral, whether I regretted letting her mother back into our lives, even briefly, even at the very end. No, I told her. I regret waiting 15 years to let myself feel any of it. Letting your mother back in for those few months, that part one don't regret at all. I could have kept the door closed that October night. Some part of me even considered it, standing there with my dinner going cold behind me. I chose to open it instead, and it cost me something to do that, an old wound reopening, a grief I thought I'd finished. But it gave me something I couldn't have given her on my own, and in the end, that turned out to be worth more than the wound. That's my story. A doorbell at 7:40 on a Tuesday, a stack of pancakes gone cold 15 years earlier, a daughter who finally got to choose her own goodbye. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. If any part of this hit close to home, tell me in the comments. I read every one. and I'd genuinely love to hear your story too. See you in the next one.